Now, concluding the second presidential summit on gender-based violence and femicide, civil rights groups say that they are not entirely inspired by the commitments made by government. This week, President Ramaphosa acknowledged the government's slow response in the battle against gender-based violence and femicide, and he also promised that he will ensure that the process to establish a national council for gender-based violence and femicide is expedited. However, South African activists are not convinced. They say there are still many unanswered questions. So for more on this, we're joined by Lisa Vetten, University of Johannesburg's researcher and gender-based violence activist. Lisa, good to have you. Good morning. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much and good morning.
So, Lisa, the summit wrapped up in Midrand yesterday, but the problems continue, don't they?
Yes, they absolutely do. And I think there is a fundamental problem, the elephant in the room that no one seems to want to talk about, which is that, in essence, what we're asking a government that is known at this point in time to be both weak, very ineffective, hampered by a history of corruption and ongoing corruption, we're asking that same very damaged and broken system to somehow magically transform itself and do better in relation to GBV. I mean, if we can't even sort out things as mundane as ESCOM, how do we plan to sort out GBV? Because it's the same government that we are talking about here. So I think unless we can get that broader system in which GBV solutions need to work, if that can't be fixed, then all this really is a very nice and expensive performance in which politicians tell everybody how much they care, but the actual people who have to implement every day find themselves with no additional resources, still in the same broken system that they began with 4 years ago when the first summit was held.
So if we look at what's happened over the past 2 days, there's one thing that I actually want to really touch on with you that may not have been, foregrounded at the summit. I spoke to two ladies yesterday because I was also there, and what they said, they lamented the fact that as people, as they put it, from grassroots, as survivors from grassroots level, people working at that level, they felt that they were not being heard even at the summit. The one lady actually said to me, it's high level English, it's academics, there are certain people who are given a voice and the rest of us are told to wait, and we are just here to make up the numbers. Did you get any of that? And what is your response to, that sort of feedback from some of the delegates?
That has, I think, been a very long-standing issue, and I think it is a very real, genuine and legitimate problem. Even things like having so many webinars and discussions on Zoom already is exclusionary as well. I think the problem with summits is that they are designed to be performative, so they are quite correct. You bring in the numbers, it looks very impressive, but then it means you exclude those who are perhaps a bit nervous about speaking in large groups, or who are worried how they may be seen if they don't speak very nicely, if it's all being conducted in English. So things like this are more effective if they run over a longer period of time with smaller, much more intimate groups where people are working on a problem. In 2 days, you simply just can't fix what's going on here. So I think there do need to be very different ways of participation opened up that take different forms. And I would also think that once you start having high-level people, it turns into a lot of pomp and ceremony. So low-key, where you have no politicians who are given no platform, is a much more effective way to go, where you can have that debate and engagement that accommodates different kinds of audiences and it gives them the space to say what they would like. Because I think they would be quite correct in their assessment.
And I also spoke to a representative from the United Nations, and she was of the view that perhaps things could have been a little more streamlined in terms of bringing the issues to the fore. And what we heard was a lot of expressions of frustration. The delegates seemed exasperated for whatever reason. And that perhaps is not as helpful in a setting like this.
Yes, I think that there have been so many promises over so many years. I mean, I started doing this work in the 1990s, and it is so depressing to still be talking about the same problems. So that accounts, I think, for a great deal of participants' frustration. You also can't sort out deep-seated problems in 2 days with such a big group of people. There should, as I was saying earlier, have been a lot less of the show and tell and display, and much more ongoing work that goes on throughout the year with smaller working groups who can focus on their particular kinds of on their particular issues. People also tend to go to summits with shopping lists, long lists of things that they would like to see fixed. You can't do that in the space of actually less than 2 days. At best, you might be able to work on 2 and 3, and you need to work on them on an ongoing basis. So, I mean, just trying to fix the courts the way they are now is in of itself a long-running and extensive discussion. If I could go into some of those problems, Akina?
Please do.
This didn't come up at the summit either. So, for example, we are seeing some real problems in the prosecution of rape in South Africa. In the 2013 financial year, we had the best, I think, rate ever of the number of cases being put down for prosecution. So in that year, roughly 1 in every 5, or 18% of all victims who laid a rape charge would have had their case put down for trial. In 2020, that number had dropped to 1 in 12. Okay, that was the impact of COVID. But last year, it had only managed to go up to about just over 1 in 10. So we've almost halved the number of rape cases that are being put down for trial in the space of less than 10 years. That's deeply concerning. That's got everything to do with the fact that the Department of Justice did not, for over a year, renew a contract for the person who's supposed to supply the specialized equipment, like closed-circuit television and microphones. You know, those are crucial, especially in children's cases. We've now seen cases where children have waited for 5 years because their cases keep on being postponed because the equipment is not working. The freezes, and again, the consequence of corruption, which means that government has placed a moratorium on hiring in many instances. They've now recently lifted that in prosecution authority. But the impact of that is that 5 years of posts being frozen in the NPA has meant that there are not enough prosecutors to also be able to handle all the cases coming in, which is also contributing to the decline. So you have too few prosecutors, you have equipment that is not working, you have a prosecution rate that is halved. What will that tell victims? And there you have a summit with everyone standing up making grand promises, where you have dignitaries from all over the world making their fine messages. And yet, to go back to your grassroots activists, that's what's happening at the coalface. And of course, you have the people who are working in that system, the magistrates and the prosecutors, who start to feel very cynical because they hear these promises, but their actual day-to-day promises, their day-to-day problems are not being addressed. I mean, some courts don't even have water and electricity on a regular basis. And then they also have to take a whole lot of understandable frustration and anger from the community who are tired of seeing things not work. So in many ways, these summits make it worse because you have this performance, this public performance that is broadcast on radio and television, but people on the ground every day who are seeing it look at the gap between the reality and the speeches and just lose further faith in government or start and just opt out of the system altogether.
And you add to the problems that you've just outlined with the courts, the other parts of the criminal justice system. You look at the actual investigations that need to take place. You look at the forensics laboratories with the huge backlogs. And that, almost inflicts secondary victimization on victims.
Exactly. And so it's those everyday, ordinary routines which are about how well government works that are not being sorted out. So, I would be very curious to know how much the summit in 2018 and this summit cost. And I would be curious to know how many shelters could that have funded for a year? How many services could that have funded into Tuzela care centers? What else could it have paid for, which might not have been as spectacular, but would have made an actual real difference in the day-to-day experiences of people?
What was also interesting, because the summit was also about accountability, hence the government ministers from various departments in attendance. But did you get a sense that there was much accountability that came out of that?
You know, if there was accountability, then certain individuals would no longer hold their cabinet positions because they have manifestly not made a difference. Then we would see real accountability. You would also see, I think, where we wonder. I mean, the person who did not renew a contract for a year in the courts, that person should not have a job any longer, but that person does still enjoy their position. So I think you've got to not just look at the ministers, you've got to look at the entire system down, that entire top layer of management, your director generals, your deputy director generals, what are they doing? Because they're in many ways responsible for the day-to-day running of the department. It's not necessarily the politicians. The politicians are just the face. So I think we've got to develop a much richer sense of accountability. I think one could ask the Commission for Gender Equality how they are using their powers. I mean, they have powers to subpoena. They could be subpoenaing some of these individuals, these high-level individuals in government, to say, why did you not do this, and what are you going to do differently? So I think we need to move beyond just giving politicians a platform and look at our other oversight mechanisms, like Parliament, which is also not necessarily always functioning the way it should, but nonetheless is the avenue we should be using, and the Commission for Gender Equality. And then I also think it's up to organizations to think long and hard as to what extent they continue to legitimize exercises that they don't feel actually make a real difference.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there for this morning, unfortunately, Lisa, but clearly, still a lot needs to be done. There's a long road ahead of us. But thanks so much for your engagement this morning. Lisa Vetten is with the University of Johannesburg, also a gender-based violence activist, and speaking to us there about, some of her sentiments looking at the two-day summit that concluded yesterday on gender-based violence and femicide.